I guess I should begin by warning you that this is not going to be your typical marriage lesson. Because one of our challenges or one of our perspectives we're trying to take with this letter is to understand it in the context they received it and in the greater context of the letter. What happens often with passages like this, especially here in 1 Peter, is we kind of lift this out of the greater context of the passage. A lot of times when we talk about marriage from 1 Peter chapter 3, we don't connect it back to chapter 2. We don't connect it to all of the book and what's really going on. We just hammer down on wives and husbands. And I think there's a place for that, by the way. I think there's a place for what I might call this morning the more traditional lesson that comes from 1 Peter chapter 3. We're just not going to do it. I've preached that traditional lesson before here. But I want us this morning to try to understand this in the context of these people. As we have talked about, and as the kind of weird PowerPoint reflects, is they felt like strangers and aliens. They felt like they were on the wrong planet. Everything they had grown up with has been turned upside down. They were raised to worship an emperor. And now they worship and serve a dead but risen king. Their lives have been directed by emperor worship. And now, as they follow Jesus, they reject that. And that had an impact on them. And so rather than talking about submission and dwelling in this idea of weaker vessels, I want us to look at this from a little bit different angle, one that's more fitting for them. And where we begin with the idea of wives, I don't know why that's working backwards now, but there we go. Where we begin with wives is understanding their culture of the day and how women were viewed at that time. Around 100 AD, Plutarch wrote an essay entitled Advice to Bride and Groom. And in this essay, he made several suggestions for a newly married couple. One of those is that married couples should combine all of their resources into a common fund where the property belonged to both of them. Now that sounds great, sounds what we would suggest today, but you have to understand, by the property belonging to both of them, it really meant the property belonged to the husband. The couple should have shared friends and common interest. But again, that really means that the husband sets the tone. And this next one will reflect that more. The wife should mirror the husband, including his moods and personality. If he is happy, she is happy. If he is serious, she is serious. And so this idea is that the husband sets the tone, leads in every way possible. And Plutarch went as far to say that a wife, when she gets married to her husband, should adopt the same gods and rituals as her husband and close her mind off to all other superstitions. The wife's faith was determined by the husband's faith. That's the idea. You see, we live in a culture where it is allowed and even encouraged for husband and wives to figure out how to love each other and to be in a union, but not necessarily have to agree on everything. And yet at that time, that was not the case. A husband whose wife disagreed with him on something as big as religion was seen as a weak husband who could not control his home. The Greco-Roman culture was built on this idea of a home that had order, that she followed wherever her husband went. And it was such a big deal that they believed that that was the path to prosperity, that if you weren't prosperous, it was a sign that there were problems in your home often. So what happens when a wife decides to follow Jesus and her husband does not? That would have been viewed as defiant rebellion. As she chooses to follow Jesus and be a believer and a disciple, and she no longer engages in the cultic worship, the pagan worship of the day and of her culture and her society. As she pulls away and no longer shows up at the pagan temples and no longer offers her own personal tribute to the emperor, as she continues to follow Jesus and pulls away from those practices she has practiced and followed of her husband's all of her life, how is the world going to view her husband? He's going to view that home as one of shame. And her presence at any Christian assemblies would mean that she is now befriending people her husband is not friends with. And so no longer is she following the lead of her husband, not only in religion, but also in who she associates herself with. She would not be viewed by that culture like the woman of Proverbs 31. They might know his name among the gates of the people, but it would not be for the right reasons. And culturally, what happens, by the way, is that Christians begin at some point in that first century to be blamed for introducing this new God and causing religious strife and going against the empire. And towards the end of the first century, what you see is that any kind of trouble or tragedy or struggle starts to be blamed in these communities on these Christians who brought these other gods in to cause conflict. And so this wife in 1 Peter 3 has decided to follow Jesus. She has, in a sense, rejected her husband and his faith. She has chosen the Lord over her family according to her family. And by the way, as 1 Corinthians 7 tells us, the husband could have easily just sent her away as a non-believer and reject her. I say all of this for you to understand how difficult of the decision must have been for a wife to make against her husband. Because we live in a house, in a world where houses are divided all the time. I mean, we live in Alabama. How many house-divided bumper license plates on the front of cars do you see of Auburn and Alabama? Wouldn't be allowed in the first century. You marry into a family, you follow whichever team he follows. And that seems minor, doesn't it, compared to what we're really talking about. I want you to go back to 1 Peter chapter 2, and I want you to notice starting in verse 13 that this idea of being in subjection or being in submission begins there in verses 13 and 14 of being subject to the Lord for the Lord's sake to every human institution. That included the empire, by the way. And then in 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 18, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. Slaves, be in subjection to your masters. And so then in chapter 3 and verse 1, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands. And all three of these roles, they're different roles. They are not the same. But what they do carry in common is this idea of submitting to an authority above. Why is he talking about that? Well, if you go back to chapter 2 and verse 11, we can understand the context. I urge you as sojourners and exiles, or strangers and aliens, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. This is the foundation for all three of these discussions that we've had, whether it is the idea of how you view Rome, or it is the idea of how you respond to your master, or how you respond to your husband or to your wife. The foundational point is your conduct has to be so honorable, above and beyond what the Gentiles could criticize, that they can't criticize you. Now, before we go any further, I want to make one thing clear. That Peter is not saying when he says, be in subjection to your... We went too far again. I don't know what's going on with the PowerPoint. Let's see here. There's the wives. It's all backwards for some reason. We went too far here. And what I want us to understand, get back on track, Terry, is that submission in these three cases does not mean if the government asks you to do something God doesn't want you to do, you follow the government. If your master asks you to do something that violates your conscience in following Jesus, you do it anyway. Or if your husband asks you to do something that violates your conscience in following Jesus, like serving other gods, submission and subjection does not mean you do those things. What it actually means in this context is you do everything else that doesn't violate your faith and practice to Jesus in order to show the honorable conduct that is greater than anybody else. Let's read starting in verse 1, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of the hair, the putting on of gold or jewelry, the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. There are some today that use this idea of rights. Let's talk about that. This idea of, well, I have rights as a wife. I have faith. And if my faith in Jesus is different than my husband, I have the right to stand up against him in every area possible because of that. And some might go as far as to even use that as a tool of rebellion against their husband. And what's going on here is he says, no, you're in submission to him. But there is a difference in the submission here. Prior to becoming a disciple of Jesus, the submission a wife would offer her husband in the Greco-Roman culture would be purely out of obligation. Because culture tells you you have to do what the husband says, or it brings shame and reproach upon you. But now she submits for an entirely different reason. One that is in verse 20 of chapter 2 starting. Because in the context when he talks about slaves, he says this: what credit is it when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For this you've been called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten. He continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but you've returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. She submits now, not out of obligation, but because that is the reflection of a transformed life who follows in the steps of Jesus. Jesus submitted, and to the point that when he is mistreated, he doesn't mistreat in return. When he is attacked, he doesn't attack in return. When he is reviled, when he is harassed, when he is slandered, he does not respond in kind. Stop and take a moment to think about the kind of arguments that often happen between husbands and wives. In most of those cases, from personal experience, I will confess, I do not rise to the level of behavior and honorable conduct of Jesus. Because when I am reviled, I revile in return. When I am mistreated, I respond with mistreatment. When I receive anger, I respond with anger. And what Jesus is trying to get us to do in our lives, and what Peter is trying to get them to see, is no, now you act differently. You don't give something to somebody because that's what they deserve. You act like Jesus, and you submit to mistreatment and suffering because that's what Jesus did. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1, it's one of the more powerful passages to me because of what it says there, that a wife, when she acts like Jesus and has the proper honorable conduct, she can actually convert her husband to follow Jesus without ever saying a word. how powerful is our conduct in the area of evangelism. One of the things that's interesting is we talk about evangelism, we talk about methodology and process, we talk about what to say. What we don't often talk about is who we're supposed to be. And what 1 Peter 3 says is that if you'll be who you're supposed to be, you can actually save souls without ever saying a word. Your conduct matters more than your words. Walking like Jesus in a behavior patterned after the Savior, willingly suffering and submitting even in your suffering. Rising above the standards of your culture and your society. If a wife will do that, Peter says, she can convert her husband. And what he goes on then, starting in verse 2 following, is really trying to help her understand what that looks like. The rest of those first 6 verses is understanding what this kind of conduct is. Verses 3 and 4 is about this idea, some take this out. Another proof text we take out and talk about modesty in clothes, which, by the way, doesn't work really well. If you want to say, see here, you should never braid your hair and never wear gold, that also means, if you follow that, you should never wear clothes, because that's the third thing he mentions. It's not what he's saying. See how silly we can get with our textual usage sometimes? What he is saying is that she has been raised all of her life to emphasize looking, for lack of a better term, to use our common terminology today, to being her husband's trophy wife. That in public and in presenting herself in a way that is adorned that would make him look better because of how she looks. One of her purposes was to be attractive and have an appearance that was lavish and even to the point sometimes of seduction and all of those things. And what Peter says is, don't do that anymore. What matters is not what you look like. That's not your emphasis. What matters is the hidden person of the heart. What matters is your character. And then he goes on to say this idea of having a gentle and quiet spirit. By the way, gentle and quiet doesn't mean weak. He's not saying that women are supposed to be seen and not heard. That's not what he's saying here. The idea of gentle and quiet is strength under control. It is the person who has something to say but knows how to communicate those things in words that are respectful and controlled. And I would suggest to you that later on in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, Peter is going to say that we can cast all our cares on, our anxieties on him because he cares for us. That one of the reasons that this Christian wife with an unbelieving husband can act in such a way is because she knows that God is going to take care of her. This is very similar to what is said about the slaves. What good is it to you if you're beaten because you sin? Your character should be great. And if you suffer because you have tremendous character and you've been transformed and you're living in the right, honorable way, God is pleased by that and will bless you. And verses 5 through 6 is simply saying, look back to these examples that have done this, that have lived in a way that you can follow their example. And he uses Sarah. By the way, the idea here of her calling him Lord is not that we should demand our wives call us Lord, but what it is that Sarah laughed and didn't believe what was going to happen, but still followed what her husband said anyway. Despite her disbelief into what God had said to Abraham, and despite her doubts about what was going to happen, when Abraham told her what to do, she followed him, trusting him. That's the spirit of this. These wives have made a choice to have a faith and a religious practice that is different than her husband's. And that was going to be difficult. They were going to suffer. Their husbands were going to suffer. Their husbands might even choose to kick them out because of it. But Peter tells them, submit. Make sure your conduct is respectful and pure, because that's how you win over your husband to the Lord, and God will take care of you. Now again, he's not saying, well, if your husband says you can no longer worship Jesus, that she should submit. That's not what this is saying. but in every way possible that does not conflict with her faith and following Jesus, she should submit to her husband and trust in him. Why? Because that's how the home she's a part of, and how specifically her behavior as a wife could be honorable among the Gentiles. Let's talk about husbands, which is interesting because anytime I speak from this passage about husbands and wives, what I hear is, well, she got 6 verses, we only needed 1, right? That's the misogynistic thing men say sometimes. Let me say this, there's a whole lot in 1 verse, though. Husband, live with your wife in an understanding way. I don't necessarily believe that this husband has to have a non-believing wife. It could have been. I know that in 1 Corinthians 7 that Paul dealt with this same idea. He said there, to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever, she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever, he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. But what it seems to be more likely is that this context is a husband who carries also, just like she did in those first 6 verses, the baggage of her culture and her society that has trained her from childhood on a certain way to act within the home. That here, what he is saying in verse 7, is to a believing husband, he's also challenging that same societal and cultural standard that has existed. And here's why I think that's important. It's important to realize that society, even Jewish society, this was not a pagan thing, looked down on women. In John chapter 4, when Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman, and the disciples come back, they don't say, why are you talking with a Samaritan? They say, why are you talking with her? Why are you talking with a woman? In Jewish law, a woman was not really a person. She was a possession. A man owned sheep, cattle, and his wife. A wife could not leave her husband, but he could send her away as long as he gave her a certificate of divorce. Marriages in this culture are not a partnership. They are not mutual. They are not equal. As we saw from Plutarch's advice to bride and groom, it seems to be presented as equal until you realize what he's really saying is the husband is the one who controls everything. There is no mutual decisions. Women are inferior to men. So when a woman believes in Jesus and her husband does not, we've read what happens there. Paul says there in actually 1 Corinthians 7:15, if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be. The unbelieving husband could put away his wife. But what about a husband who now believes? How does his belief in Jesus change the way he views his home? I think that's the proper perspective of verse 7. So read verse 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Husband, live with your wives with understanding. Why? Because they are heirs with you of the grace of life. Here's how you should read that. Husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way because they are co-heirs with you in grace. They are mutual heirs with you in grace. They are equal to you in Christ. You see, what is ironic is that today people read these passages about husbands and wives, and they view them as archaic instructions that are outdated, that the husbands get to boss the wives around. It's an oppressive thing. But yet what actually this passage is saying to husbands in verse 7 is change the way you view your wife because she is a mutual heir with you. She's equal to you in the kingdom. But wait a minute. Women are to be in subjection to their husbands. Yes. But that role of the husband leading the wife and the wife responding to the husband with her submission does not change their inheritance. It does not change how God views them. but it does challenge the societal norm. The husband is now obligated to treat his wife in a way he has never treated her. Because in Christ, she is no longer property. She is not a thing. She is his sister. And so what does that mean? Well, we live with them in understanding. We see them differently. And again, when we normally preach this idea of living with them with understanding, we kind of revert to this modern interpretation of this passage. For example, this is where we normally talk about how understanding wives is so difficult because men are from Mars and women are from Venus. Or one of my other favorite book titles about this, Men Are Waffles, Women Are Spaghetti. Or another one, Men Don't Listen, Women Can't Read Maps. Those are all, by the way, book titles. And we may chuckle at those, but that's not where we're headed today. Part of the understanding he has to have is an understanding of how she's been treated in society, and now he views her differently. How that she's been property, she has been inferior, but now she is his co-heir. She is his fellow heir. She is his mutual heir of the grace of life. She is not excluded from the privileges he enjoys as a follower of Jesus. She shares them. Jim Samoa said, husbands, seek to understand the more difficult road your wife has been asked to walk and recognize what makes her feel loved and valued. That's the idea here in this first century application. And that's the idea of Ephesians 5 that we read during the Lord's Supper talk. Husbands, love your wives. Husbands are supposed to respond in love with affection to their wives and adoration, not view them as property or inferior. And let's talk about that idea of inferior, because people often love to go to 1 7 and talk about how women are the weaker vessel. And we try to say how this is obvious because women aren't physically as strong as men. And yes, that is true. I mean, the reality is, even though we live in a society that likes to promote equality, there is a reality that if you take most sports, like tennis, and you take a man and put him against even one of the best women in the world, usually the man is still going to win. But that's not what this verse is saying. The verse is telling the husband to view his wife like a weaker or precious vessel. And the idea of a vessel could be the same idea, as I've often explained, as a vase. Listen, if you had a mink vase, because when it's mink, I think you have to say vase instead of vase, even in the South, you don't let little kids play around that. It is too priceless. You put it up, you protect it. One might even suggest that you have no business owning it, more than likely. But if you do, it is protected. It is behind something that keeps it from getting damaged. And I believe it is that same idea, that husbands are to view their wives as this precious, priceless thing, who, by the way, has been treated as an inferior thing for years, but now your eyes are open that in Jesus she is equal with you and you should treat her as such. And as you do that, understand that you have a responsibility not just to lead her, which is the oppressive, archaic thing everybody wants to focus on, but to protect her. To protect her from ever feeling like she is not your co-heir. I want to remind you that Galatians 3 said, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Treat her with the love and respect she deserves, just like Jesus did for you. What Peter's really trying to get these husbands to do is to reject the misogynistic values of their society and to view their wives differently and to view them with the same love and concern and sacrificial care that Jesus viewed them while they were still in their sins. Why? Well, we could go with what verse 7 says at the end, which is, husbands, if you don't do this, if you revert back to your old life, if you go back to the old dead way of your culture, your prayers will be hindered. You ever thought about that, husbands? I mean, let that sink in. The way you treat your wife can keep your prayers from being heard. But I would suggest it goes beyond that. It goes back to exactly what we talked about earlier from chapter 2. The reason why a husband should do that is because that is honorable among all people. Here's one thing that's interesting when you think about the Greco-Roman culture is that while they might have treated their wives like these possessions at home, in public, they presented a front or a facade that made everything look good, because whatever the husband did, the wife never contradicted. But what you have now is the same idea presented, but in a genuine, authentic way of two people who actually love each other and treat each other with a love and respect that they see patterned in Jesus. And so when you live this way, Peter tells these strangers and exiles, when you as husbands and wives have marriages and homes that look like this, the Gentiles are looking at you, they're waiting for an opportunity to criticize you. And they won't find it. Because you're living in such a way that is honorable, even among the Gentiles. One of the things that we need to learn from this, all of us, not just husbands and wives, is that when we decide to follow Jesus, it impacts every part of your life. It changes we like to compartmentalize things. We like to have our work self and our home self and our church self and our community. No, it permeates every area of your life. Jesus changes you. You no longer walk the way you walked. You no longer behave the way you behaved. You no longer talk the way you talked or dress the way you dress. Why? Because you are transformed by Jesus. You are no longer living according to the flesh. You are ones that walk by the Spirit. And one of the things that I see sometimes today is that people who are spiritual, who I agree with in practice and even conviction, are starting at times to use that religious conviction as a justification for poor behavior. We live in a world that feels like if you disagree with me, I can say things to you in however way I have to get my point across, even if it's ungodly, because the ends justify the means. And that's especially true in weeks like we've had this week, where maybe those of us who are more conservative in our thinking feel like the other side has responded in violence and hate towards those who hold ideals close to us. And we may be tempted to respond with behavior because they've reviled us. We want to revile in return. And because they have attacked us, we want to attack in return. That is not conduct that is honorable among the Gentiles. And when it comes to our homes, I will tell you, I'm a firm believer that the home is the foundation for any culture and society. That when you see societies and cultures and countries that are in peril, that are in danger, what you see is you see homes that are not reflecting the home designed and outlined in the Bible. When the foundation of the home cracks, the society and the culture is close behind. We are surrounded If you substitute the word Gentile for heathens or unbelievers, we are surrounded by unbelievers. And they are watching us to see if our conduct and behavior is honorable. They are watching the way you treat your wife. They are watching what you do. They are watching how you behave around your children. Wives, they are watching how you respond to your husband when you differ in opinion. We, by the way, we as God's people are expected to set the standard and example for all of the world. It is not something that can be legislated through law. Enacting laws to force people to follow the pattern for the home will always fail. But showing people what an honorable marriage looks like and the blessings that come from it will not only honor God and rise above the test of those who seek to criticize, but like that wife in verse 1, by being the kind of people we're supposed to be, we can actually win over the world one soul at a time without a single word. We have to live like a way that sticks out, which means we have to be willing to be strangers and exiles. People who really believe this world is not my home. May God help us to raise our standard up to His own. Let's stand and let's sing this song together.